Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my dear friends, I would like to discuss the frozen Russian assets, and most specifically the latest decision on the 12th of December that changed profoundly the rules by which the voting goes on in the European Union, blocking out the opposition of Hungary and Slovakia, and as a matter of fact of Belgium, in order to push through what the European Union calls officially the immobilization of Russian frozen assets in Europe. Now, my topic today and my focus will be on the Russian position in this regard and the countermeasures that the Russians can take and the political consequences, the fallout for the European Union itself, for Ukraine, for Russia, and for European Union's leadership relations with President Trump. So this is my objective. But let me first explain what happened and how it is different from the routine meetings and endless consultations and endless debates about how to proceed with the frozen Russian assets. So there's about 210 billion euros in an organization called Euroclear. This is where they were deposited by the Russian government years ago. And there are treaties regulating these funds that were signed between Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Russian Federation. And there are dispute resolutions and the tribunals that will have to handle this in case something goes wrong. Now, when what the Europeans call Russian aggression, or what I call civil war between Ukrainian parts, escalated to an open conflict between Russia and Ukraine in 2022, the Europeans have frozen. Now, frozen means that they still belong legally to the Russian Federation, and they can be unfrozen, and it is assumed that they are to be returned to Russia once peace is declared in Europe. However, what the Europeans have discovered is that they are running out of money, and Ukraine regime of President Zelensky is running out of money, and they were desperately trying to raise money somewhere, especially in the situation as now when there is no money. As I discussed in my previous video, there's a 23 billion gap to be filled in the annual budget of France, and indebtedness of France is 120% of its GDP, and it's the same situation, 130% in Italy, and Britain is in terrible shape, and there's a de facto recession in Germany. So there is no money to give to Ukraine, even though the European leaders want to do it. So they came up with this idea. First, it was to give the interest from Russian frozen assets, and they have done so already in the amount of 18 billion euros so far. Now they come up with the next idea, in view of the fact that the United States is scaling down its involvement and its financing of Ukraine in this war. So they came up with this idea to confiscate Russian money, and they've created a mechanism that looks like it's legitimate, although it will be disputed in the courts. Have already begun this process, the Russians have. So the procedure is that up to now, the European decisions had to be by member states with a veto power, every one of them. So what they did on the 12th of December is change the rules, citing economic difficulties and emergency, which is supposed to be only in the time of war, of the European Union Treaty, in order to bypass opposition of Hungary and Slovakia and make a decision by simple majority, declaring these funds irreversibly immovable. In other words, Russia has it, but it can never touch it, and it can never return it unless it pays reparations to Ukraine. Now, of course, this is hardly could be called a proper procedure, because who gave the right to the Europeans decide that Russia had to pay reparations? Now, what if there's a different kind of ending of the war and a peace concluded without reparations? That's theoretically possible. So the way they phrased it is that in any case, in order for Russia to receive its money back, it would have to pay reparations because European Union says so, and not even by the consensus of all member states, but by a simple majority. So Hungary has already denounced this as a violation of EU statutes. And my focus will be specifically on what Russia can do. So here I come to the most important part of my presentation. What is the fallout of this decision that is going to be probably, most likely, 90% approved on the meeting of the heads of state on the 18th of December? So the question, of course, is what are the Russians going to do? What is their reaction going to be? This is what I'm going to discuss now. But also, it's very important to discuss what it would do to Ukraine. Would it help Ukraine to continue the war or not? What it would do to European Union itself and its cohesion and its reputation. And then the final point is, what would it do to the Atlantic relationship? Because President Trump is not very happy with this action by the European Union. So first, let me turn to the Russian response. Now, according to specialists, the Russians do not have any state sovereign funds in Russian banks, but they do have all kinds of assets by various private companies. And many of them have stayed, some of them have left, but their funds were equally frozen in Russia, and they're called sea funds, in that they theoretically still belong to their rightful owners, but they cannot be repatriated unless there is a permission to do so by Russian authorities. So the total amount is unknown. There are various figures cited. One of the figures I read is 190 billion euros or dollars, I don't know. Another figure is several hundred billion dollars worth of those assets, assets of private entities in the Russian Federation. Now, yes, these consist of private company subsidiaries, bank deposit, securities held by EU-based firms and banks such as Raiffeisen Bank and Unibank of Italy. Now, the Russian reaction still is unfolding, but there are three areas that the Russians can respond. One is already initiated is action in the courts. And in the courts, it's an agreement between Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Russian Federation, and Euroclear and the Russian government, which stipulates that there should be an independent tribunal, and its decisions are binding. And the seizure of assets is totally unprecedented act that had never been done before. This is what the Belgian Prime Minister gave his objections, because even during World War II, Japanese and German assets were not seized anywhere. Now, Japan is opposed to this de facto seizure, and so is the United States. But nevertheless, so Russian response is likely first and foremost be in the courts. Then there is talk in the Russian media, and the Peskov, the spokesman for President Putin, and others have been talking about the seizure and outright nationalization. Indeed, that could happen. I don't rule it out. But my personal view is that the Russians are not going to do it. Because here's the reasons. Those companies that stayed are those that have pretty good relations with Russia, and they decided to stay despite EU's very serious push to get them out of Russia, and they stayed despite all the pressure. So I don't think the Russians are going to confiscate the property of companies that are friendly to Russia and have stayed and do business in Russia. In fact, the record is just the opposite. President Putin has always tried to show that it is a safe business environment in Russia, and that if the Europeans are breaking the law, Russia is not going to do the same thing. Moreover, it's very important for Russia to demonstrate to the global South that private property is safe in Russia, investments are safe regardless of the twists and turns of foreign policy, and so my view is no, they're not going to touch these funds. However, that doesn't mean they're not going to do anything, and the most interesting reaction to the idea of Russian retaliation was what could be called reputational loss. And that is that Russia will encourage friendly countries to withdraw its assets from Europe. Moreover, this is what the Prime Minister of Belgium talked on his own accord. In other words, euro becomes unreliable. Eurozone becomes unreliable, and therefore it's much safer to keep your money in in dollars or in yuan. But not even that is the most important thing. I have heard Alexander Mercouris, citing an official in Moscow, say that the Russians are in a way quite happy that the Europeans have done it, because this undermines the validity of European guarantees and the observation of the international law and the sanctity of sovereign funds. If Europeans can seize Russian funds, what would prevent them from seizing anybody else's funds of various countries in the Middle East and Asia? So if there is no particular preference to keep your funds in euros, why not move them to other destination? But even that is not the most important for the Russians. It proves to this global South that keeping funds in Europe is not advantageous, and it's much better to create a different system of payments, as has been in the works by BRICS. As we know, over the last couple of years, the Russians have tried very hard in order to develop eventually a new currency, but at least a new system of payments, which is sometimes called chain block, a very sophisticated system of payments that would bypass both the euro and the dollar. And the seizure of Russian assets is exactly that kind of a reminder to those countries that are still sitting on the fence, for example, India, that one has to move in that direction and create a totally independent system of the European corner of Eurasia. So this is now about the this is my transition to the topic, what the consequences of this will be. For EU, the most serious consequence would be not so much Russian litigation, which will take forever and with unpredictable results, but a loss of legitimacy. The violation of the well-established procedures post factum, changing the rules of the rights of member states post factum, and of course loss of reputation and attractiveness of Europe as a depository. Now, violation of the original treaty is very, very important, because when the small countries of Eastern Europe joined the European Union, they joined under certain rules and provisions and guarantees. And now that they're stripped of those, and if they will have to pay for the decisions taken without them, such as if peace is concluded and a court will decide that Russian sovereign funds should be returned to Russia, then European Union would have to spread the burden of payment on all European states. And that would mean that Hungary, for example, or Slovakia, or even Italy would have to either pay up or say goodbye to the European Union and say, no, we're not a party to this. This was taken without us or with our opposition, and we're not paying. And no, as sovereign countries, nobody can force them to pay unless they impose sanctions on them, which they can, of course, challenge in the courts. So for European Union, I think the losses are far outweigh the benefit of having 140 or 190 billion for Ukraine. Now, as far as Ukraine is concerned, what would it do for Ukraine? Well, on the surface, Ukraine will have funds for another year. That's it. Mr. Aristovich calculated that 190 billion would run for a year of Ukrainian expenses. If, of course, some of it will be stolen, as has been the case so far, and some of it will be diverted for European needs of processing the funds and all that's consulting fees and others, whatever Ukrainians get will be enough for a year. However, this is just money. Money has to be turned into weapons, and that is by far more difficult because Europeans cannot challenge Russian production at the same capacity, nowhere close to it. And even the Americans have a long line of customers to buy their Patriot missiles, and they simply physically cannot produce even if they're paid for. So immediate relief for Ukrainian war effort is not going to be very significant or sufficient to slow down Russian offensive. Now, this is the consequences for Ukraine, just a temporary reprieve. Now, what it would do to European standing, I've already expressed. Now, the last word is EU relations with the United States. Now, the decision to confiscate Russian assets is a challenge to President Trump. Some analysts call it a declaration of war on President Trump, because Trump has expressed his opposition to this, and in his peace plan there were other proposals how to use Russian frozen assets for the restoration of Ukrainian infrastructure and so forth. So by seizing those funds now, European unions essentially give Russians a carte blanche to walk away from any peace negotiations. Why should they continue peace negotiations when their money is stolen and given to Ukraine to continue the war? I mean, it's an insult both to Russia and to the United States. And that is how it is understood, both in Moscow and in Washington. So from that point of view, the Europeans have shot themselves in the foot. It could lead to a rebellion inside the European Union and to sharply worsening relations with President Trump. So this is all for now, my dear friends. Please subscribe, please put your comments, and please see my other playlists and read my book. And for now, goodbye.